You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is a special live stream we are putting out here in the wake of the Supreme Court decision eliminating a legalized right to abortion. And I am Eugene Puryear, of course, alongside my co-host Rania Khalek. I don't know if it's good to be here with you, Rania, but I'm happy that we could be together for this moment.
Same. I know that we were expecting this. We were talking before we started recording or going live that we were expecting this, but despite the fact that we knew this decision was coming because it was leaked not too long ago, it's still just so shocking and so outrageous.
Yeah, I mean, it really is the height of outrage. I mean, there's so many implications to this. There's so much to be said for those who are unaware, just catching up, or just looking for a little bit of where we are. This morning, a decision was released by the Supreme Court in a ruling on a case that was brought in the state of Mississippi, known as the Dobbs case. Ultimately, long story short, the Supreme Court opinion, 6-3 opinion, did rule that Roe v. Wade and the Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which reaffirmed Roe in 1992, were to be reversed. They were reversed, which means that the national legalized right to abortion in the United States has now been eliminated. And as the Supreme Court stated in the majority opinion, that the states now ultimately, or perhaps the United States Congress, is where the right to abortion and women's rights, and I think many other rights, will ultimately be decided. Like I said, there's a lot of implications, a lot of discussion happening in the United States about other cases that could fall. Of course, obviously, a lot of the issues that are out there in terms of what this really means from a state-by-state basis and all the various other pieces. And so there's a lot to be said about all of this. I mean, even if we were here for 8 hours, I don't know if we could get to it all, but we're going to try to get to as much of it as we can. We've got a lot of fantastic guests. So if you have the opportunity or the ability to share this so that whoever is following you can follow us, it would be greatly appreciated and I think greatly informative for many people as outrage, quite frankly, continues to sweep the nation. Again, after the Supreme Court of the United States in a 6-3 decision has eliminated a woman's right to choose. But we are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show to start us sorting through all of this by Jessica Mason-Piccolo, who is a senior vice president and executive editor with Rewire News. Jessica, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on this very dark day for this country.
I think where I wanted to start is, really maybe the direct implications of this. I mean, I think people are hearing a lot about, some states where abortion remains legal, some that it's illegal now, some where it could be within 10 days. So what does this decision in Dobbs mean in terms of, how many women are affected and sort of the geographic landscape of where this leaves us with the woman's right to choose?
So the first domino has fallen. That is where we find ourselves today. When the Supreme Court said full-throatedly that it is reversing Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, for the first time in this country's history, it took away a fundamental constitutional right that it had previously recognized. So that's the level setting. Where we stand in terms of impact is that there are, according to Guttmacher Institute, at least 13 states right now that have trigger bans on the books set to take effect, if not immediately, within the next couple days. Missouri's has already taken effect. We have places like Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, Utah, for example. Those are all among the 13 that those trigger bans will be happening soon. And, just for some context here, in the current legislative session, lawmakers in Louisiana were trying to go beyond that trigger ban and declare abortion life beginning at conception and it a homicide. So they were already looking to criminalize the outcome regardless of what the court did. We also know that there are about 13 more states that are poised to enact their own bans. So we are looking at abortion being illegal, not just inaccessible, illegal in at least 26 states in the country by the end of the summer.
Wow. Over half the country, you're going to have abortion being illegal. And actually, I didn't know that. You said this is the first time the Supreme Court has overturned a case that they had previously, or a decision they had previously made. I actually did not know that. That's utterly shocking. Here's a map, I believe, showing what we're talking about in terms of, it's a little bit blurry for me, I'll be honest. I can't read some of the language on it. But I believe it's showing where, there's bans and where there's not bans. And of course, this is going to go into effect as time goes on, but it also gives other states an opportunity to basically decide abortion is illegal. Can you maybe walk us through what this means? Because it, in terms of like access to abortion across the country, we understand in some states it's going to be available, in other states it's going to be illegal. But what does it actually mean for women? Like, I don't think people recognize or understand that this actually means there are women who are going to die as a result of this decision. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So those are two really important points. And we don't even have to talk about the idea that women might die as a hypothetical. There is a U.S. couple right now that is stranded in Malta. They were on vacation there, and the woman was pregnant with a wanted pregnancy. It hadn't gone to viability yet, and her water broke. Malta has a complete and total abortion ban. So she is in a hospital trying to not get sepsis and die until the fetal heartbeat that she has inside her right now ends. Like, that is the reality today. In terms of how this will play out beyond just abortion, what folks need to understand is that the only way to enforce an abortion ban is to consider failed pregnancy outcomes as suspicious, right? So this is a decision that massively expands the criminal surveillance of pregnant people. What do I mean by that? If you are pregnant and you live in a state that bans abortion and you find yourself in the middle of a miscarriage and go to the hospital, healthcare providers may ask if you did anything to induce that miscarriage. If so, they consider that a crime. These were things that were happening already in this country, but as isolated incidents. This is now a mass expansion of that kind of criminal surveillance state for anybody who has the capacity to become pregnant. The other thing that folks need to understand, for those who don't pay attention in the day in and day out to the abortion politics fight in this country, is that the anti-choice community has been very clear. They are not shy about the fact that they're not satisfied if this is a decision that just goes back to the states. They do not want New York or California or Colorado acting as abortion safe haven states. And so there is a campaign to take this nationally, whether it's to intimidate patients and providers and make it too difficult to try and travel to access care, or to bring a federal ban should Republicans take power after the midterm elections and the presidential election. Sam Alito's decision today in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health leaves open that possibility. He didn't say the abortion question should go back to the states. He said it should go back to the elected officials in Congress and the states. That's a tell. That is a tell.
You know, one of the things that I'm also curious about, because if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know, in the Dobbs or in the Mississippi law that was at issue there was no exception for rape and incest, and I think sort of very narrow exceptions in other circumstances. So, I mean, what are the implications of that? Because I think a lot of people might hear, okay, Roe's overturned, but assume that there's, you know, various avenues for certain cases like that.
Yeah, I mean, the more and more the anti-choice community is also clear that they don't want any exceptions. So when those exceptions exist, what does that look like for a pregnant person to try to avail themselves of them? If you happen to live in a state that bans abortion but has certain exceptions for cases of rape, you need to be able to prove that your pregnancy was a product of rape. So that means you need to be able to report your pregnancy to the police. For example, you need to name your accuser. What do we know about how sexual assault cases are handled in this country? What do we know about the way that women feel safe about reporting those instances? What do we know about the number of abusers who are known to women, right? Those are not real exceptions.
You know, you also have followed this for quite some time, and I think one of the things that, I don't know, for some people it almost feels like this came out of nowhere, but and this kind of snuck up on them, especially I think people who are a lot younger who maybe haven't had a lot of experience. But I mean, this really is the culmination of a plan. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, this is a concerted political campaign to undermine and reverse constitutional rights in the privacy arena. They're starting with abortion. They won't stop here. And one of the reasons why it may seem to come out of nowhere for folks who aren't as tuned in is because for a long time, conservatives weren't honest about their intentions, right? Susan Collins is the perfect example, right? She was sure Brett Kavanaugh would vote to uphold Roe versus Wade. He promised her, darn it. And so the idea that there would be any sort of, critical thinking among the media in reporting that out, for example, helps build the situation that we're in. And I mean, honestly, people have very busy lives. I understand if you have your job and your family and your caregiving responsibilities, and you just want to be a person in the world who doesn't have to think about the heavy things all the time, that you're not going to be as tuned into this. But what folks really do need to understand is that for conservatives, when it became politically unpopular to be vocally anti-school segregation or pro-school segregation, they immediately pivoted to the abortion issue. So this is about maintaining white evangelical power in the halls of Congress, in the courts. This is a power grab, and they're using abortion to start it.
I'm glad you framed it that way, that it's actually bigger than just this one issue. I want to ask you about what the options are now. I remember, I actually think it was a year ago, or maybe a little less than a year ago, that we actually had you on to talk about this coming situation that we're now discussing that actually transpired. And I remember that because it was around the time that there was I think some sort of flooding in New York, and it was like last August maybe that we had you on to talk about that.
Oh, I totally remember that.
So this has been ongoing, right? So we've known this is coming. Democrats know this is coming. What are there any tools at their disposal to do anything about this? I know Biden just spoke, and I didn't have a chance to hear what he spoke, but I've seen people on Twitter complaining that his he didn't say enough in his speech, or he didn't call the Supreme Court out at all, and he didn't push for actually doing anything. I actually don't know if that's true. I didn't listen to his speech. But what could Democrats have done, and what can Democrats do moving forward while they still have a majority in the Senate and House, assuming, of course, that there won't be spoiler Democrats, which we all know there will be, who actually aren't even pro-choice. But what can they do, if anything?
I think your question just answered itself. I mean, this has been the real chronic problem within Democratic politics. First of all, the big tent issue, right? Democrats have been real reluctant to make fidelity to abortion rights a litmus test within its own party. Why? What that tells me is that Democrats don't think that I'm entitled to the same bodily autonomy as Joe Manchin. That's what that tells me. So if they want to get serious about being the party that respects civil rights, they need to get serious about being the party that respects civil rights and start within their own ranks. The Democrats have had the majority for a long time under the Biden administration and have done nothing when it has come to abortion rights. We haven't seen an executive order. Would these things be upheld in the courts? Probably not. But you know what? The fight is important. What I hear as a woman who has been in this for over a decade, what I hear as a voter when these things come up, is that I'm a side issue. I'm not a central issue. And I think that says that Democrats are still talking to white guys in their party primarily. That's still the default, even if they rally around Black women when they need the votes, and even if they rally around the Latino population when they need the votes, and they tell us to go march when the court does something like strip a fundamental constitutional right away for the first time in history. The Democrats need to fight, and they need to bully pulpit. They need to call this out. Joe Biden could issue executive orders that says, you know what, we're going to nationalize federal property and start making sure that people can abortion on military bases. You know what places have a lot of military land? The South. You want to know how many military outfits are in places like Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas? There's something concrete. And would it work? I don't know. Who cares right now? Let's try. Right? There is value in the fight. And this is where Democrats have really dropped it, because 10 years ago, this Mississippi case was a Hail Mary. And today, the Supreme Court just upheld it. Let's throw our own Hail Marys.
Yeah, I mean, it really, it speaks to so many different things. I mean, it also speaks to sort of a separate question in a way, which is, this question of the Supreme Court itself. I mean, obviously, Alito says the Constitution didn't say anything about, abortion. It also doesn't say that there has to be 9 Supreme Court justices. And, it feels that we're living in
nothing
this
about
sort
slavery.
of like antiquated reality where, I mean, the vast majority of people did not want this to happen. As you noted, I mean, this was a political campaign. The Senate itself has so many undemocratic features. I mean, it seems like this just really brings home a lot of the just anti-democratic realities that are embedded within the criminal legal system.
It's absolutely true. I was on a media hit before this for British media, and their minds were boggled. They're like, we don't understand how this happened. And it was, they were boggled by the process, right? It wasn't even just the politics around abortion rights and access in this country. They were really like, I don't understand how a majority of people in this country support abortion rights and vote for candidates and elected officials who also support abortion rights, that this just happened. Can you explain it? And the only explanation is the fix is in. The fix is in on these things.
Jessica, I know you have a lot going on, so we don't want to hold you forever. But I mean, if there's one sort of takeaway that you want people to have in this moment, what would that be?
It's an illegitimate Supreme Court, and they've declared themselves illegitimate. The idea here that for example, Justice Sam Alito in the Dobbs decision would say, we are going to look to history and only cherry pick the portions of history that support this opinion is all anybody needs to know. And don't take my word for it when I say that this is an opinion that will not stop with abortion. Justice Clarence Thomas, in his concurring opinion, said specifically, the time is now for the Supreme Court to revisit its cases legalizing birth control, legalizing same-sex marriage, legalizing same-sex relationships at all. Justice Clarence Thomas and the conservatives on this court want to revive the anti-sodomy laws at the same time that we have evangelical preachers in places like Texas calling for the execution of LGBTQ people. These are dangerous times, and this isn't just a thought exercise.
Jessica Mason-Piccolo from Rewire News, thank you so much for joining us and giving us some of your time.
My sincere pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Rania,
I mean,
there's so much that can be said, but there's just too many. There's just so many threads to pull on here. I think that, at the end of the day, there is a real question, I think, about, so many things. But, Nancy Pelosi already has a fundraising email out. And, she was just
I've already gotten
campaigning
so many
for Henry Cuellar,
yeah.
the last, anti-abortion Democrat in Congress. You have these people, Joe Manchin, who's saying, and by the way, Joe Manchin has also put out a statement. Jessica made the point about Susan Collins saying, well, they promised me they would never do this. Joe Manchin also saying, well, they promised me, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, that they would never do this, and I can't believe they've done this. He's already said that he doesn't want to end the filibuster in order to rule on this issue, to rule on the Women's Health Protection Act. And so, here they are saying that they, get out and vote. And by all means, if there's someone who's going to get in there, who's going to change their vote on this, but a lot of the people who, already have shown their inability to take the action correctly are the ones who are, at issue here and continue to be at issue here. And I've said this before, I've said it a million times, there's a conservative majority that's a bipartisan majority in Congress that is against progress, it's against civil rights, it's against civil liberties, and it continually is weighing in on the side of all these various things. I think there's going to be a lot of people protesting, pretty much all weekend, I'm sure. Already starting today, it's already happening. But I can understand what people are saying. And one of the things that Biden said is he said, well, I understand people are upset. I understand they're frustrated. And then he makes this whole plea for things to be peaceful. He referenced that people said he hadn't spoken up enough against the intimidation or whatever they're calling it, alleged intimidation against Supreme Court justices. And he's peaceful. look, I'm not calling for anyone to do anything violent or to hurt anybody or do anything like that, but to emphasize that in the response to an extraordinarily violent decision. I mean, you laid this out, Rania. I mean, people are going to die because of this. An extraordinarily violent decision, economically, socially, politically, against tens of millions of people in this country. And he's going to make a big point of basically saying, make sure your reaction is appropriately muted as opposed to outrage. And it says so much.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think the point also that Jessica was making about this being like an effort by these like white evangelical men to like maintain control. I think this is something that I actually saw in Liberation News about the Supreme Court really existing to uphold like the ruling class and what they want. It's not about democracy. It's not about checks and balances or ensuring that things are fair or by the law. It's literally about ensuring the ruling class maintains its power. And this is about, at the end of the day, maintaining power. And I know we like to talk about conservatives, but there's a reason the Democrats aren't doing anything to stand up for it, because they're a part of that same system. Yeah. But also, this also goes back to the fact that there is so much dark money that has been spent over the past 2 decades. Yes. We don't even know where it's coming from to stack the courts, to make it so that the Supreme Court has a conservative majority, to make it so that courts all across the country have right-wing judges. And this is the outcome of...
Ooh, Rania, I think we might have lost you. I don't know if you can still hear me, but I'm just going to allow the booth to address that and hopefully tell me if it's you or if it's me. I think it's just me. Well, why don't we see if we can get our next guest on here? I know that we have Kim Smith with us, who's an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation in South Carolina. Seems relevant since Liberation News was just mentioned. Kim, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Kim, you're in South Carolina. Obviously that's going to be ground zero, already has been ground zero around the attacks around, the rights to abortion. Maybe just my first question for you is, hearing this, what is the impact that you think this is going to have in people in situations similar to where you are all across the South, especially women of color from working class backgrounds?
I mean, our Governor McMaster already put out a statement that said that he was so glad about the Supreme Court decision and it was bringing back constitutional rights.
Wow.
So, and we already have a trigger ban in place, so they are ready. And just I think I'm just so angry, and I think the ramifications for women of color just makes me even more angry, especially in the South, where we have places like the Low Country and Charleston that have some of the highest eviction rates of women, in the Southeast. We have things like women don't have access. We already don't have access. Low-income women already don't have access. They barely have access because of the Hyde Amendment. If you have Medicaid, you can't get, access to Planned Parenthood in those different places to get abortions. And so we can't get an abortion. Anyways, but this just makes it even harder, and really just economically how it impacts Black women. As somebody who had an abortion, I was making $7.25 an hour with a 5-year-old son. How was I supposed to be able to support another child and pay rent and have put gas in my car to get to work to the job that paid me $7.25? It's like these ramifications are just so far reaching, and Black women are always the first on a chopping block when things like this come to pass.
Kim, Rania, I see that you're back here. I don't know if you are 100% in. I see you smiling, so I don't want to jump over you if you want to add something.
Well, I think I might be lagging a little bit. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, cool. Actually, I wanted to ask if you could speak to the nature of what I was talking about before I was so rudely cut off YouTube, which is about how the Supreme Court exists to uphold the power of the ruling class and why that makes it illegitimate. And I'm sorry if you were already talking about that.
No, I mean, it's not there to protect human rights, because if it was there to protect human rights, we wouldn't be in this fix where abortion rights just got yanked from everybody. It's there to uphold the status quo of the elite. It's there to protect the interests of the people who run this country, who hate working class, poor, and oppressed people. That's just it. And no matter how many times the U.S. government tries to tell us that, oh, we're here to protect your rights, and the Supreme Court is upholding the law, you know, like you said earlier, Ronnie, there's no, like, they let slavery happen. Like, all these different bodies let these horrible things. They let cops kill Black people. The Supreme Court lets kids not eat lunch because they don't have money. Where is the Supreme Court when human rights violations are happening right here in our streets?
Yeah, I mean, that's an extraordinarily good point. And I mean, you know, it speaks to one of the issues that I think is going to come up here, and one that I already sort of spoke to, which is there's going to be, you know, mass protest. I think some have already started in different parts around the country. You know, I think that they're going to be, you know, continuing, well, who knows for how long. Tens of millions are outraged. I mean, talk about the importance of that, Kim, because I think, you know, we've heard from President Biden. We're hearing from the Democratic officials. You know, their line is abortion is on the ballot in November. You got to put more people in Congress who support this. So they're actually, it seems to me, downplaying and attempting to subvert the calls of people to protest and to channel it into the electoral arena in the fall.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, look how long it took this decision to come down. People have been waiting on pins and needles for weeks, months for this decision, for weeks. People have been waiting to hear what happened, and we knew the outcome. We knew what was going to happen after the leak. But they did that intentionally to quell protests. They did that so people wouldn't get in the streets, because when the leak happened, people were in the streets immediately. And they weren't expecting that type of turnout for a women's rights issue. And so they, of course, want you to channel all this energy and all this anger into voting. The Democrats, I continue to say the Democrats had the House. You know, people voted Democrats in, and they couldn't even get the Women's Health Protection Act passed to put this into law. So what people need to do, and what is happening, like you said, is be in the streets, but don't just be out there. Stay out there and continue to protest and continue to make noise and continue to pop up and do what you need to do to get this overturned. And like, it's up to states now. So you really got to hit these legislators in your states.
Can you also talk a little bit about the fact that we live in, but we have literally no welfare state to take care of women who have children?
Exactly. You know, we see the baby formula shortage. We see that, daycare centers and things like that are getting closed across the board. We see that Medicaid expansion in the South, most of every Black belt state in the South, if I'm not mistaken, Eugene, I know you're going to fact check me, but most of every Black belt state in the South did not get a Medicaid expansion, So that means that thousands of people are going without healthcare access. And that means thousands of women, because disproportionately Black and brown, Black and Latina women, we're the most likely to be on Medicaid. So we don't have, we don't have access to a lot of healthcare.
I think that's an extraordinarily good point. I mean, it's sort of like and I think this is an important point that you just made, Kim, especially because, the way that this is often framed, and I think the way these issues is often framed is, that this is like a suburban white women's issue. I mean, and it certainly is their issue. I think it's everybody's issue. But I mean, when we talk about the disproportionality in terms of deaths, the disproportionality in terms of access to care. I mean, I was actually watching on HBO Max the other day this movie, Jane, good documentary. I'd encourage people to watch it, about the underground abortion network in Chicago. And they were saying that after abortion was legalized in New York, immediately their clientele became almost all Black women, poor Black women, because people with money could fly to New York to get an abortion. But that disproportionality, Kim, I think is an extraordinarily important aspect of who this is really affecting.
Yeah, exactly. And so many times you see that this struggle has been, like you said, just like a white middle-class woman problem. But if we really just take a look at history, like Black women have never had reproductive justice or bodily autonomy. I live in a state where on the state house grounds, it's a shrine to a man that, to Sims, who did experiments on enslaved Black women. We've never had reproductive justice or bodily autonomy. And like once we got Roe, they immediately put the Hyde Amendment into effect so that disproportionate amount of Black women and Black and brown women could not have this access. So I think, and also, y'all just had, Dr. Brew on talking about Brittany Murphy. She's a pregnant mother incarcerated, which is also a part of this struggle, for reproductive justice and bodily autonomy, because we also have to think about how women who are incarcerated, who are pregnant, people who are incarcerated who can have children, do not have access to reproductive health care, who don't have access to these things. And again, that falls disproportionately on Black women.
So I'm wondering if we can shift this for a moment to like something I keep seeing on Twitter, which is how this is your fault if you didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. This is your fault if you didn't vote for Democrats. Can you, both of you, please?
Can we ban them?
Oh my God, so many people, and I'm so sick of it. So can both of you address this constant trolling? Like every time, this is your fault, you didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. Apparently it's not Ruth Bader Ginsburg's fault for like choosing to not retire when she had cancer. But anyways, please take this on for those of us who don't know how.
I mean, when somebody says, well, it's your fault for not voting for Hillary Clinton, I want to let's take a look at Hillary Clinton's track record. Let's look at Hillary Clinton's track record with marginalized communities, because if I'm not mistaken, Hillary Clinton was one of the main ones calling Black and brown people monsters and savages and all this and all that. So please tell me where it adds up that if I vote for her, me as a Black person is going to have some kind of rights to bodily autonomy when she's already shown how she feels about us. And you can also look at her track record when it comes to any type of social justice issues, any type of issues. Hillary Clinton wasn't out there with Black Lives Matter. Hillary Clinton has not done anything to police brutality. Hillary Clinton was a main campaign point was giving more money to cops, if I'm not mistaken. It was like putting more money into the prison industrial complex. So when it's a topic like this that is this is a human rights issue, a civil rights issue. So when it comes to an issue like this, please tell me, somebody show me where it shows that she or any of the other Democrats, for that matter, have cared about human rights or civil rights.
I think that your point is extraordinarily well taken and extraordinarily well made. I mean, one, you just have to have a level of historical ignorance, I think, to make that argument. And I would say, twice in the past, in this century, let's say, the Democrats have controlled the Senate and the Congress. When President Obama became the president in January 21st of 2009, Democrats controlled both houses. When President Biden became president in January 21st of 2021, the Democrats, and they continue to, control both houses of Congress. I can't actually remember it correctly here now. I don't think in 93 they did have both houses of Congress, but I could be wrong about that. But nevertheless, it's not as if this is like an unknown element of what's going on. I mean, certainly they've had both houses in the wake of passing about Roe passing in the 1970s. So, I mean, the Democrats have shown time and time again that they will not, in fact, take these actions. And when you look at what just took place with the Women's Health Protection Act, I think that's the clearest thing. All these people saying vote for Hillary Clinton, that's irrelevant. That was in the past. Right now, this year, Democrats had both houses of Congress and the presidency. They claim that they are for the right to abortion. They did not pass the Women's Health Protection Act because they did not have the votes in the Senate. They didn't have the votes in the Senate because two of their own members, two who were willing to go public, let's just remember that Manchin and Sinema take a lot of arrows, probably for other people who agree with them, said that they would not eliminate the filibuster to rule on this. The filibuster, and anyone who's protecting the filibuster, the history of protecting the filibuster is exactly what Manchin is doing. It's preventing the ability to have civil rights in the country. I mean, the primary defenders of the right to the filibuster or of these high thresholds, the 60-vote threshold for a discharge vote, are historically segregationists and others who want to block significant progress. So forget Hillary Clinton. Why is Joe Manchin not in there? People did vote for the Democrats. People are acting like, oh, you didn't do X, Y, Z. They did put them in there. They've done it twice since the turn of the century. Both times, the Democrats have refused to codify Roe versus Wade into law. So the idea that you not voting for Clinton somehow dealt with this, the idea that voting for Democrats, is going to fix it in the future, people have already done this, and the Democrats have shown themselves to be completely and totally useless.
Yeah. I think it's also... No. It's a really good rant. I think it also speaks to the fact that we don't actually live in a democracy. I mean, geez, like if the polling on this says one thing and then you have a small group of people saying another, Like, how can you call it a democracy? And that speaks to something else. This is the country that runs around the world saying, we have given ourselves the right to police all of you because we are the image of progress and like democracy. And then look at this. Like at some point you have to think there has to be a segment of elites in America that actually view this as like negative for empire. Because how can you go around claiming to liberate the world when you just went back 50 years? I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah. Well, Kim, let me ask you this. I know you got a lot going on and are working and mobilizing. I mean, maybe if you like, talk about some of what y'all are doing in South Carolina. But, you know, what's your message to everyone out there who is feeling outraged at this?
I think my biggest message, I think, for people is, you know, we got to do more than just be angry. We can't just sit home. We can't just sit home and be angry on Twitter. We can't just sit home and be where digital activism has its place. Not going to knock it. But this is the time where we need to be kicking the door down. We need to be out in the streets, and we need to be bringing not just on our own, but bringing more people into the struggle, educating people. Eugene, you know, you've talked to it. It's got to be some type of historical ignorance or something. You know, there's a gap there. We need to also be educating while we're mobilizing and organizing, because it's going to take all of us. It's going to take millions upon millions and hundreds of thousands of us to get in these streets and stay in these streets to make change. It didn't, you know, the things that happened with Derek Chauvin didn't happen overnight. Any type of tiny change that we got didn't happen overnight. It happened through struggle. And right now, at this moment, people need to not be afraid to struggle and get out there.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very well taken point. Kim Smith, organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, thank you so much for joining us here on Breakthrough News.
Well,
there's a lot there. For those who are perhaps just tuning in, you are, of course, watching Breakthrough News. I'm Eugene Puryear here alongside Rania Khalek, and this is special coverage in the wake of this morning's decision by the United States Supreme Court that ruled 6-3 to overturn the Roe v. Wade and the Planned Parenthood v. Casey decisions, which means that the codified legal right to abortion in the United States has now been abrogated. As you might expect, people are very angry about that. And I think we have a clip here of protests that are already taking place at the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. And that was the Supreme Court building, their courthouse, and the far background there. And those are protests that are going on there. There are protests called really in all parts of America, at least from what I've seen so far, or at least, you know, every region. I've seen something from at least every region. I think, and do suspect it will reach every nook and cranny, as it were, in the country. I mean, I think there's obviously tens of millions of people who are going to be affected by this, and there's so many different elements to it. And you know, you already have a push in Congress by some. Marco Rubio, I know, has introduced a bill already, or has at least drawn up a bill already to try to prevent Congress from codifying the right to abortion in the legal code. You know, ostensibly, at least at this stage in the game, that will not succeed, but Republicans could potentially be like, Republicans could potentially be back in power in the fall. So then I guess we're just going to have to see. But nevertheless, you know, I think, Rania, that people are rightfully outraged on so many levels. And I think the impact of this is going to be perhaps, I don't even know if people can really fully guess this. I've heard a lot of different numbers of the people who potentially are the number of people living in these states where almost certainly abortion will be legalized. Someone told me it was 58 million women in those states. Wow. I don't know if that's more or less that, but it just gives you some, sounds generally right, 26 states. So I think that's one of those things that we're just going to have to see. You know, one of the things I want to note here, Rania, and I think we might have a image that speaks to this is, you know, as much as the so-called pro-life movement, and I say so-called because I think that's their own branding of themselves, sort of presents themselves in that way, like they are good and right. But this has been, in addition to, as you pointed out, a very well-funded movement, a pretty violent one too. I mean, certainly for those of us who I think, can remember the 90s and the 80s, the images of the bombings, and we have it up here now. And I think it's important for people to look at this. I mean, from 77 to 2020, 11 murders, 26 attempted murders, 4 kidnappings, 104 attempted bombings and arsons, 42 successful bombings, 194 successful arsons, and these are of abortion clinics, of course, the assassinations of doctors who were performing abortions, the attempt to kill individuals, the assaults on women, the daily harassment, which is not captured here, of anyone going to facilities that potentially provide abortions by these people who stand out there and harass people all day long. But I really wanted to sort of bring that home, because I think that a lot of people are always like, well, it's the pro-life movement, as if they're just some sort of like normal political entity or whatever that through, hard work and elbow grease has been able to change the law. But I mean, these people have used assassinations, bombings, all forms of terrorism, in addition, of course, yes, to voting and mobilizing, but also mobilizing these huge dark money funds to pervert any sense of democracy. I mean, it's really, 4 kidnappings. I don't know. It's just, it's wild that they're able to brand themselves as, the so-called pro-life movement.
I actually have I think that's a really, really important point, because essentially they've helped achieve what they've wanted to, or at least partly what they've wanted to, through terrorism. Like, I don't know what else to call this list of acts other than this is like political violence. It's terrorism. But I actually have a question for you. It's something that somebody asked me, which is why is it that socialist countries, even the Soviet Union, I think East Germany, one of the first things that they did was they legalized abortion. And then it took a lot of these Western capitalist countries much, much longer to get there. I'm curious, what's the connection between socialism and reproductive rights? I think it's a good
it's a good point.
One
of the things that Mao Zedong said many years ago is socialism can't be consolidated without the liberation of women. And I think when you look at the history of socialist movements around the world, one thing should be abundantly true. Leadership of women has been a prominent and important part of, I would say, almost all progressive movements, but certainly of the socialist movement in this country, in Europe, in the global South. So that in and of itself is one of the connections, is that socialism, which has always held out that the issue of patriarchy is a form of class oppression that, moving beyond not just capitalism, but all class society towards communism, should uproot, has placed at the center the importance of, not just abortion rights, but the rights and the leadership of women in general to have, total and complete equality in all spheres. And so this, of course, has become a factor in many socialist countries over time and over history. And I think, as you pointed out, many have been noted as having been pushing forward, not just rights around abortion, but of course institutionalizing the right to childcare, institutionalizing the rights, or many rights, to women in the various realms and spheres of employment, promoting affirmative action in a number of the different areas where, certainly in the West, we still see today, there is science and technology in particular where women are often excluded. So I think the connection in some ways is ideological, because it speaks to sort of the overall sort of foundational historical understanding that socialists have about, patriarchy, racism, xenophobia, and their roots not just in capitalism per se, but in class society more generally, and saying, okay, if we're going to transcend that, we actually have to move to a different system, but we have to then be able to enshrine these rights right away to show that we're serious. And I'd say also, just the agency of women themselves, who have played an important pioneering, leading role in many of these countries and many of these revolutions and movements, who, are establishing as a matter of course their own rights and their own peace. So, I think that it's an interesting thing. I think it's a notable factor. I think about this society that we live in and others over years of what they value and what they don't, and the fact that, whether we're talking about racism, if we're talking about a woman's right to choose, a lot of the discussion in capitalist countries around what to do about these issues has been influenced by what's happening in socialist countries and a desire to not look bad, quite frankly.
Yeah, and of course, like the same people, I mean, I know everybody keeps raising this, but it can't be stated enough that the same people who want to force you to take all pregnancies to term are the same people who don't want to give you health care. Who don't so that you can actually do you know how much it costs to have a baby in the US on average? And I know this because when I was in Cuba, I actually asked people to guess how much it costs to have a baby on average in the US. It was between $15,000 to $20,000 if you don't have health insurance. And that's just like a regular birth, a vaginal birth where there's no complications. So imagine how that stacks up when there is complications. So you don't get health care, you don't get daycare, you don't get guaranteed paid maternity leave. Women in America, working class women, literally have babies and go to work a week later, which is just shocking to me that exists in the most, the richest country, supposedly richest country in the world. Your children. Yeah, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to add that also, we don't take care of children. We literally defund their schools, particularly children in working class and poor areas, so that they have to be 40 kids to a classroom. In some cases, we shut down 50 schools in Chicago, all Black schools, done by Democrats, by the way, under a Democratic mayor and a Democratic president. But of course, you have a move by Republicans to literally just privatize education. You don't, I mean, you don't get, we have a baby formula shortage in the US. You won't even give mothers who either aren't able to breastfeed, maybe because they have to work, or who can't breastfeed. You don't want to, we've had people in Congress, I think bipartisan, it's been a bipartisan thing to say it's not the state's job to produce baby formula. Yeah. And you have a baby formula shortage. It's just at every step of the way, you make it impossible to have children. Have existing children, yet you want to force women to have babies.
Yeah.
And you want to take away, you don't even want to fund family planning. You don't even want to fund family planning so that at least you can, if you want to talk about reducing abortions, if you really think abortion is so immoral and you want to reduce the amount of abortions, that doesn't happen by making it illegal. We know how you reduce abortions. Women don't want it. Most women I know who've had abortions would have rather had not gotten pregnant in the first place or been able to feel like they could actually have a kid and not go bankrupt. Those are primarily the reasons people get abortions.
Yeah.
And you don't even want to touch those issues. So what's left?
Well, it really is
incredible.
Yeah, it's an unbelievable attack. It's an attack that's been going on for some time. One of the things that I just, want to show here, two things that are connected, but first is a graph about the number of abortion providers in this country and the way that it's gone down since 1982, which I think speaks exactly to this issue of the sort of long-term attempts to chip away in every possible way of a right of the right to people to have an abortion, the woman's right to choose. And I want to lay this. You can see there in 1982, and I'm sorry, this only goes up to 2017. It's actually lower now, but you've got 2,908 total places in 82. Where their abortions were provided, 1,587 by 2017. So, you're seeing huge numbers of abortion providers drop out. And a lot of that is connected to the image we put up earlier about the range of violence that has gone on in relationship to this movement, the 11 murders, the 26 attempted murders, the 42 bombings, 194 arsons against abortion providers, people seeking abortions, and the facilities in which they are done. This is one of the things, in addition to all these other very restrictive laws that have been passed, trap laws, many of them called, you have to have hospital level, surgical facilities, or all these different little things, or doctors have to be licensed in certain ways, or all the various little ways to chip away, to chip away at the access to abortion, to make it almost a sort of right on paper, but not in reality over time, and then to continue to bring these cases in order to try to do what they've done now, which is to eliminate it legally. And I think to see sort of the multi-leveled reality of that, to use sort of terrorism and thuggery in conjunction with, you know, the so-called democratic process in order to eliminate fundamental rights. I mean, you know, in many ways, I think perhaps the best comparison is the campaign to end the civil rights against Black Americans in the destruction of Reconstruction, where, of course, Congress was involved, the courts were involved, President was involved, but underlaying all of that was this other campaign of terrorism and thuggery designed to essentially set the stage for the ultimate denouement there, where the rights would be knocked out. And then one thing I just want to show here, Rania, and then, you know, we can talk about it, but that's related to that, is a map of how far people are going to have to potentially travel in order to receive abortions. And it really, I think, gives a sense of the challenges here, because, you know, we've had a lot of companies come out today, and here it is. And just so you understand, essentially the darker the map, the further you have to travel. And those darker purplish blue areas, the darkest areas, it's 400 plus miles. So you can see huge swaths of Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, North Dakota, looks like Utah, parts of Nevada, where people could have to travel 400 plus miles. And of course, you know, and I say that because, you know, JP Morgan has come out, Levi's has come out, a number of companies have come out today saying that they will pay for their employees to travel to get an abortion. And hey, look, that's all well and good. But I think one thing people have to remember is, you know, in many cases, you can't travel. I mean, one, not everyone works at these places, but two, there can be medical complications. There can be all sorts of issues that mean you can't just hop on a plane and go to California to get an abortion. And I think that is something for people to remember when you look at these kind of maps. I mean, you look at Michigan, up there, higher parts of Michigan. Michigan, by the way, even though it has a lot of Democrats, a Democratic governor, one of the states with a pre-Roe ban on abortion, which means that there could be some real challenges there.
Makes it a felony.
Yeah.
Makes it a felony.
Makes it a felony.
Abortion is a felony. Abortion and giving an abortion is a felony. You know, talking about the distance here, there's also, I can't remember exactly which states. I want to say Oklahoma, but I also might just be stereotyping. So to Oklahoma, if I'm wrong, I apologize. You might be able to correct me on this. But the idea of basically, if you leave the state to get an abortion and then come back, you could be charged with a felony if somebody tells on you.
Yeah, that's huge. And that, you know, that was something that Attorney General Merrick Garland has mentioned this morning in relationship to this. He says that the Justice Department's understanding is that it is not, in fact, legal to do that, that it's not legal to ban some of the by-mail abortion methods. But the point about that is, and I think this is the point you're making, Rania, is you can say something all day long, but that doesn't mean that these states can't do it and start prosecuting people and start throwing people in jail and, you know, basically say, test us. If the DOJ wants to come after us, come after us. And I think what was notable is that President Biden, who repeated some of these points in his speech, didn't really speak to what they would do. I mean, he said, I'm going to do everything I can to fight that. We don't believe that. But it was, if you want my honest opinion, less than rousing in terms of his, you know, approach to these things. And it just to me reminded me once again about just how decrepit the Democrats are. I mean, you know, our first guest, Jessica Mason-Piccolo from We Wire News, made this point, which Attorney General Garland said this morning. Their understanding is that federal institutions and facilities can, in fact, still perform abortions, and they're not held to this. So, like, why are they not opening up every military base, VA hospital, you know, HHS buildings, Social Security office? I mean, there's a lot of federal offices, a lot of federal land, a lot of federal programs. I mean, where's the program from the Biden administration to roll out a nationwide system of abortion providers that can't be touched by these state laws? I mean, where is the urgency to try every possible thing they can? Instead, he's just saying, well, show up in November and we'll help you. Well, if I live in South Texas and I want to show up in November and vote for the Democrats, I got to vote for Henry Cuellar, who is against the right to abortion. So it just, the whole thing is wild.
Well, there's also the Hyde Amendment, right? The Hyde Amendment is something that a lot of Democrats supported, which was basically banning the use of federal funding, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Of going to abortions, of providing abortions. So if you have half your party, I'm throwing that number out there. I actually don't know if it's half of Democrats, but I feel like in the Senate, that is probably accurate to some degree because they're quite conservative there. But if you have a lot of Democrats who are against, they'll say they support reproductive rights, but then they're against any federal funding for abortions, then how can basically like a right-wing Democratic president,
well, it's also,
you just explained?
President Obama, just to note, did issue an executive order to essentially reaffirm the Hyde Amendment that, people's names who have gone back. That guy, Bart Stupak, the representative from Michigan, he's not there now, Democratic representative, added an amendment to the ACA bill to restore the Hyde Amendment. The Senate then stripped it out. But to get his vote, an executive order was issued by President Barack Obama. That's 13535. Sorry, I just looked it up. But remembering this is back in 2010, that would essentially, brought that piece back. So, we've seen Democrats willing to sell out the right to abortion time and time again, despite always standing up and saying, we are the world's greatest champions for women's rights. Put us in there. And here we are. They're in there.
But if you don't vote for us, it's your fault. If you don't vote for us, it's your fault. And also, please give us money. Please give us money so you can vote for us. So somehow we can fix it, even though we're already in charge. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah,
anyway.
No, I mean, it really is, amazing. Sorry, I'm just looking at some of the breaking news here. I mean, it's just, you just don't even know what to say. It's like, the Democrats are in there now. Like, how are you about to say abortion is on the ballot? I mean, and okay, yes, to be fair, obviously there is some element to this that if, some of these Republicans were knocked off, perhaps somehow, some way they could get to the 60 votes that they would need. But I mean, not only does that seem heavily far-fetched, but to speak to the point, I don't even know where these people stand. I mean, let's say you do go vote. Let's say you do get more Democrats in there. Let's say instead of 50, you have 57. So you still don't have enough to override or to have a discharge on a filibuster. So are these people like Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, are the new senators from North Carolina and Florida and these other places where they're, hold themselves out to be centrist in the kind of Manchin, Sinema, Susan Collins, Jean Shaheen fold? Are they going to be against, are they going to say overturn the filibuster to do this? I mean, all these are questions that are unanswered, and where the reason they're not even raised by a lot of people who want to support the Democrats is because they know the answer is almost certainly no, and that you could probably have 55, 56 Democrats in the Senate, which would be a huge increase, and they still almost certainly would not be able to pass the Women's Health Protection Act because there's not enough Democrats who are unwilling to get rid of the segregationist filibuster in order to pass important legislation.
Yeah, exactly. On that note, I believe we have our next guest ready to go.
I think we do, and we are very honored to have with us back on the show Marva Hayden Hilliard, who's a constitutional rights lawyer and the executive director of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund. Marva, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
Thank you for having me.
I guess maybe my first question is what is the basis for this decision? I mean, I saw that Justice Alito, just disgustingly tried to place this decision in the lineage of Brown v. Board of Education in terms of what they were doing. And I just thought, well, that can't be right. So what is actually going on here?
Well, and in Plessy, his whole presentation is this, weaving that somehow eviscerating women's fundamental rights to control their bodies, to control their futures, to control their lives, is in the long, proud tradition of recognition of civil rights. Nobody reads that and takes that seriously, either in a layperson's read of it or in a lawyer's read of it. We know exactly what's happening, which is it's a deeply political court. It's a deeply political court that has shown its illegitimacy, and the Supreme Court rests on the consent of the governed. That's the reality. They issue rulings. We all accept the rulings to some degree, whether we agree or don't agree, because it's this concept, right, of the fundamental authority of this pillar of government. But that is a very tricky precipice. And this generation and my generation and all of those that have fought for so long, for so many years, are not going to accept this ruling. And it's that simple.
So what are the options legally speaking? I mean, we always hear like once a Supreme Court ruling has been made, that's it. That's the end of the road. It's over. There's no going back. Is that true in this case? And if so, what are other avenues with the institutions that exist in America, if any, to overturn what was just overturned?
Well, that's exactly the question, right? So the way that the court functions, and it functions in a pillar of American society as the judicial branch, is this concept, the concept that the court issues rulings. It's the final word, it's the final legal word, unless it's something that can be given a legislative outcome, in which case there can be a legislative change, and that society functions to whatever degree within the confines of those rulings. But when you decide, as this court has decided, that it's going to issue a ruling that is such a dramatic imposition on fundamental human rights and restriction or attempted restriction on human rights, you cannot expect that humanity is going to go along and agree with that. And yes, you can turn to a legislative end. The question is, will Congress pass a law that protects fundamental abortion rights? But will they? They haven't so far. The Democrats have, the House and the Senate. The Democrats have had the House and the Senate in the past under Obama. They've never done this. They haven't done it now. And equally, when things shift course, who gets to decide? This is one of those times where it's up to the people to decide. People have to make the decision collectively how we are going to govern our future and our lives.
You lead up by this decision because it does seem like this is really just the first domino, the opening shot of something bigger.
Well, Eugene, I just lost the sound there for you at the end of what you were saying. But okay, now I've got you again. With regard to Thomas's opinion, I mean, we know that this is the truth, and he's actually saying exactly what they're thinking. This court and the right-wing forces behind it and the religious forces behind this imposition on women is part of an effort to eviscerate and roll back decades of hard-fought rights that have been recognized by the court. Now, we believe those rights are ours, and the issue is a Supreme Court enshrinement and recognition of rights. And when the court is now looking at using the language it used in this opinion, which it will use and which Thomas is pointing to, as the next basis to now roll back all of these other fundamental rights that have been recognized, including marriage equality, even going way back to the recognition of the right to contraception, all of these elements in a patriarchal society that control other people's lives. They are looking at every opportunity now to take back these hard-fought rights that have been recognized by the Supreme Court. Really, you could see it coming from the labor movement in the 30s, and then the recognition of rights to protest, to the civil rights movement, and people taking to the streets and forcing these recognitions, again, of fundamental civil rights, with the marriage equality movement that just broke out and was so massive in the streets, and then a recognition of the right to marriage. And now what we're seeing is them intending to dismantle everything they can dismantle and take us back decades, and we're not going to go.
And I think that raises a good point about where we should look to for maybe inspiration or guidance at this point in time. When you talk about like the people in the streets, there wasn't always the decision for Roe v. Wade, and abortion was illegal in America at one point. And there was activism, women's organizing in the pre-Roe era to push against that. And then, of course, today, I mean, speaking of more modern times, I guess, you also have all of this activism across Latin America that has actually succeeded in gaining the right to abortion and decriminalizing abortion across so many countries in the last decade alone. So what do you think we can learn from past movements, current movements in the global South about how we in America should deal with this issue?
The court, even though it claims it's, not political, is of course deeply political. And the court, not just as the individual personalities, but the American institutions from, the court to the legislative branch, they are reactive to the movement in terms of the defining nature of people when people come together as such a power and such a force, and an immovable force that must be reckoned with. And when people in society make it clear exactly what course society will be on, that is a forward course, that is a course towards human liberation, and that they will not accept anything less, the institutions either have to follow that course because that is the course of humanity, or they render themselves illegitimate and face those outcomes. And we are at one of those incredible defining moments today with this ruling, which again, as Thomas is signaling, is just going to be the start of an effort to eviscerate hard-fought rights, but rights that no one is giving up.
I think this is such an important point, Mara, this tradition, of civil disobedience, maybe we should call it, of people standing up for what's right, sort of regardless of what the status quo ante may have been. And, I mentioned it earlier, I watched it myself. I know probably many people have seen this HBO Max documentary, Jane, about the underground abortion network in Chicago, late 60s, early 70s. Obviously many people are going to be out in the streets. And I guess I'm asking sort of a twofold piece here. I mean, on the one hand, we had Biden's, ridiculous call in his speech, saying peaceful 30 different times about whatever the protest should be, which to me didn't really read peaceful. It read muted and totally unobjectionable. And then I think we have this question of, I think many people, defying these laws. And I guess, I don't know exactly what I'm asking here, but where do you put this in this conversation around, what needs to happen now?
Well, even if we talk about this as like, what is the law? I mean, the law that Alito is citing as like the ground on which this stands, right, is he's citing cases from like 1602 and the 1700s. And, Matthew Hale, who was this extraordinary misogynist who believed that men had the right to beat their wives because, of course, women were property. And when the court is talking about it makes this argument that there is no right for women to have access to abortion as health care under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause because the restrictions on abortion, in their view, are not restrictions that are based on basically an effort to repress women. That it's like a neutral restriction on abortion, like that's it. Instead of recognizing, as of course the court is not going to recognize, but as we all recognize, that this is an outgrowth of patriarchy and an effort to suppress humanity, and a large portion of humanity that has gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years. But that's actually what's in this opinion. It's like, have the Taliban write your opinion. And this is what they're asking all of us to accept and consent to is, hey, like 1602, like that isn't going to fly with people. That isn't going to stand. So when, as you're asking, like, well, like with the Jane Collective, with the movements, with the struggle for society and for societal change, that is what's going to happen now. I mean, people are going to be out there and people have to be out there.
Mara,
actually, I want to just... before you ask your question, I just wanted to point out, I actually am not even sure what the Taliban's position is on abortion, but they may not actually be against it. I just wanted to throw that out there because that's the kind of thinking, like, it's like, wow, you might be worse than the Taliban on this issue. Think about that, people in the Supreme Court. Go ahead, Eugene.
I hope a lot of people.
That's a really important point.
I mean, I'm not sure, but I think that they might not have an objection to abortion. Jesus Christ.
Well, the court's view is
that lower third
is that restrictions on abortion are not a sex-based classification, right? So it's not subject to what's called heightened scrutiny, and that's actually the position that they're taking. So they dismiss out of hand any 14th Amendment equal protection claim, and then the question becomes the 14th Amendment due process claims, which is what they have overridden today. That there's any grounding there. That allows women to control their lives and other people who become pregnant to be able to control their lives. But we understand that even where this affects the LGBTQ community, that the repression of women and the repression of the LGBTQ community is grounded in patriarchy and a demand that people are controlled and fit into patriarchal roles.
You know, Mara, you're already speaking to this, and I'm glad you brought up that 1602 piece and also Hale and others, because, I saw, maybe my fault that I was even amazed by this, but, just an amazing study the other day about, women who had been surveyed about the impact of an unplanned abortion, 60 some odd % were worried they'd have to stop working, they wouldn't be able to go to school, that their mental health would deteriorate. I mean, just keep talking if you could about this reality, because I think to some people it's so far from their minds, what this really means to force, at least potentially tens of millions of women in any given circumstance to carry a pregnancy to term against their will.
Well, it affects women, of course, in so many different ways. But, from the medical issues, which you were touching on earlier, and, the extraordinary level of maternal mortality in the United States, from what it does to a woman's body. I mean, if a woman chooses that she wants to be pregnant, that she wants to proceed with gestation, this is still a huge toll on a human body. But of course, for many people, it is a toll that ends in death and or extreme, medical crisis. And aside from that issue, the idea that women, which is really what's in this opinion, is that women are vessels, and that women are objects, and that's where we go back to the Matthew Hale and those bright thinkers of the 1600s and 1700s when it comes to women or anybody else. And the idea that women are objects, the idea that women are property, the idea that women are vessels, the idea that you can actually do forced gestation, which is what this is, that's telling all of these, tens of millions of women and other people in the United States can get pregnant, that, you can be subject to forced gestation. And it defuturizes people. I mean, that's ultimately what it is. It defuturizes women. It says that you don't get to go to school. You don't get to live your life. You don't get actually to have those other children that you might have had you not been forced to have children now, but then had children at another point in your life when you were ready to have children, and give them the life that they deserve as well as your own life. It's a complete destruction of a human life to force somebody to be pregnant and carry that pregnancy to term, whether or not that person is, then able to put up for adoption or whether they're forced to care for the child. It's an extraordinary destruction.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mara, I really appreciate you being willing to join us. And just real quick before we let you go, where can people find the work of the Partnership for Civil Justice Fund? Because I know you're on the front lines of many, many crucial fights.
You can follow us on Twitter at the PCJF, or come to our website, which is justiceonline.org. And please do, because we're going to have everyone's back, because we expect and will be with everyone in the streets on this.
Mm-hmm. Right on. Well, Mara, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just don't even know what else to say or think about this issue right now.
Well, one thing I just want to reinforce here, and I've actually seen different numbers on this in terms of, how many people are in favor of it. So I don't necessarily, I've seen everything between 58% and 72%. But the key point I'm trying to make here, just to reinforce for people, that the majority of people in the United States did not want this to happen. They believe that Roe v. Wade should stay on the books and should not be overturned. So this is a minority decision in every possible way. A minority of people in the country who support it, majority are against it. It's also an extreme minority of people who, and there's a graph there, and that's from Data for Progress, with 58% of all likely voters saying that Roe v. Wade should remain in place, only 30% saying it should be overturned. Now, again, I've seen some higher numbers, but the point being, I don't think there's any survey out there that shows that anything other than a distinct and clear majority. Of course, 62% of women, that seems extraordinarily relevant, to this piece. So, 62% of so-called independents, but that, speaks to something. But, again, you have a majority of people in this country who did not want to see Roe v. Wade overturned. You have a extreme minority of individuals. I mean, you look at the Senate that approves Supreme Court justices. the Senate is an intensely anti-democratic institution. And so you actually have a huge number of people who are in places that have almost no people, but they have the same amount of rights in the Senate. And that's not to, take a shot at Idaho and Wyoming and places like that. No disrespect to those states. But, compared to California, which has 30-some million odd people living there, it seems to not make much sense that they're on the same sort of platform. So you've got this minoritarian institution in the Senate that approves these justices who are not elected, who then serve for life, and 6 of them were able to overturn the majority will of the country. So at every single level, this is anti-democratic. At every single level, from the opinion polling to the way the judges are are approved, and to the judges themselves and the institution of the Supreme Court. And I think that really, in the so-called greatest democracy, shining city on a hill, all these things that we're taught about America, I think is a crucially important fact that these 6 people were able to overturn a fundamental right that undoubtedly is going to mean that people are going to end up dead, even though they're in the extreme minority. It's quite a statement.
No, I think that you just said it so well. What it comes down to is that we have an anti-democratic system. This speaks to everything wrong with America. Like, this one decision shows what a farce it is that we care about democracy, have a democracy, that these people are going to be in power for life. We're going to have decades to come. Well, maybe not decades, but we're going to have a conservative majority of psychotic, like fascistic people. I mean, these are like right-wing fundamentalists that are controlling the Supreme Court. And Democrats, again, aren't saying anything about the Supreme Court. They're not talking about the Supreme Court being illegitimate, which they should be. They're not talking about changing how the Supreme Court functions or works, which is what any actual democracy would be talking about right now, because of how anti-democratic this is. I mean, those numbers show it right there. Like, if this court can overturn the will of the people to this extent on such a basic reproductive rights issue, what can't they do?
And I think that's the scary question. I mean, because when you look at a lot of these justices and a lot of these conservative people, they're against everything. And I think our first guest, Justice Mason-Piccolo, pointed this out, that the big uptick in the right-wing push around trying to destroy the right to abortion was, when they were switching away from the more or less discredited idea that schools should be segregated. And I think there's always been this sort of long, very connected jurisprudence of racist, segregationist, patriarchal individuals who want to limit all rights. They also tend to hate unions too, tend to be the same people. Mm-hmm. They don't want you to be able to join a union. They don't want you to be able to have an abortion. They don't want you to be able to go to the school that's closest to your house just because you're a different race. It's all the same people. And they consistently change their guise. They have chameleon-like phase. And, one day they got the Trumps saying that they want to stand for workers, MAGA, all of this. Well, what about the millions of women workers who are now going to be forced to carry kids to term that, could be products of incest, products of rape, that they just don't want at that moment. I mean, that's, it is what it is. They say that they're, against taxes, but as, it's been said before, Lee Atwater, they only said that because they couldn't use the N-word and make it about black people. I mean, we really have to be clear about the core of who this is. I mean, this is the most right-wing pro-capitalist core of the political system executing their political agenda. And again, I just want to say, the Democrats are making everything about November. They still control the House and the Senate. They refuse to do anything about this because of the so-called filibuster. But what is the filibuster? I mean, I think this is important, and I won't say too much about this, but it's important for people to know, because the Senate makes all their own rules. They make their own rules. That's actually in the Constitution. People talk about what's in the Constitution. Senate makes their own rules. Now, until 1917, there were no rules around filibustering, right? Like, you wanted to filibuster, you filibuster about whatever. Then, because Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations bill failed, he pushed the Democrats to pass this law, which was the first law in 1917, to say that you have to have a certain threshold of votes in order to end a filibuster, right? Like, you can't just talk all day. If you can get X number of votes, now that's 60 votes, you can just discharge it and end it right there. So from that time, 1917 on, what the filibuster started to become was the key tool of segregationists primarily, but also others, to prevent any progressive legislation on civil rights to pass. And that's why historically the filibuster has been denounced by everyone who's ever fought for black liberation in this country since that time because of the way that it had been used. At any moment, they could get rid of it. They could change it. It's not in the Constitution. They're their own rules. They've already gotten rid of the filibuster, by the way, to confirm judges. So, you can get confirmed to destroy the rights of women with 50 votes, but you can't actually protect the right to abortion without the 60 votes because Democrats refuse to change a made-up rule that they could change at any time. If they're really upset, they could change it now and change it back after they do the vote. I mean, there's nothing stopping them at all from codifying the right to abortion right now in Congress. It does not have to wait until November. It certainly doesn't have to wait until a new Congress sits in early January. It could happen right now, and they are refusing to do it because of a totally made-up rule, despite the fact that all of these people who refuse to change the made-up rule say they support a woman's right to choose, support the right to abortion for anyone who can become pregnant. They claim they do it, but they won't do anything about it. And I think that's a really important statement about where the political system is and where we are now. But, that's my main rant. And I think we might want to end the show now that I'm just randomly
Preach. No, I think people need to hear that. I think people need to hear that in this moment because right now they're going to be inundated with MSNBC pundits and maybe even people on CNN, and a million emails because you signed up to support one Democrat one time, and now the emails just don't stop. A million emails saying, give us money so you can elect us in November. When, oh my God, you are not doing anything right now with the power you have. So people need to hear that because they're not going to hear it anywhere else.
That's right. Well, I'm Eugene Puryear, and I'm here alongside Rania Khalek. This is, of course, Breakthrough News. Follow us across all your social media platforms at BT Newsroom. We're going to continue covering all of the fallout and implications from this, and there'll be protests going on and other things like that. So you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe, hit the bell so you can get the alerts, and follow everything we have coming out about everything. But we are going to do our best to keep you up to date on everything happening in the wake of the Supreme Court eliminating the right to abortion in the United States. I think that'll do it for us here on Breakthrough News.